problem in general is that we don't have either a way of constraining governments to only do the handful of things they would be better at, or if they do them, to actually get them to do them better. Because let me take a particularly extreme example, and that is that one of the things that the U.S. government does in order to deal with climate change is a massive policy which has two effects. It has no effect at all on climate change, it turns out, although it was claimed to when it was instituted. And it makes much more expensive the chief food of 200 million people, most of them poor. That's the biofuels program. The U.S. is the world's largest producer of maize, what Americans call corn. The U.S. converts something like 13 or 14% of the world's supply of maize into alcohol. And maize is the chief foodstuff for about 200 million people, mostly in poor countries. Well, that's a massive contribution to world hunger. And it doesn't even reduce CO2, it turns out. So that's a case where there is a theoretical argument for the government subsidizing things in order to keep down CO2. It's not as good an argument as people think, because we don't really know what the net effects of climate change are going to be, but people think they do. And if it was clear that they were negative and large, there would then be a plausible argument for government doing that. But it ends up doing something that doesn't achieve that objective, does a whole lot of damage in the world. Why does it do it? Because it pushes up the cost of, up the price of maize, and that gets you votes from farmers. As Al Gore, to his credit, has admitted.
I think that this example of air pollution and climate change is quite interesting, especially because it's existentially large and looming. But
well, it isn't. That's a popular lie. If you actually read the IPCC reports, or if you read Nordhaus, both of which I think are too pessimistic, Nordhaus's estimate is that if we do nothing at all about climate change, by the end of the century, the world will be a few percent poorer. That's not an existential threat. The existential stuff is because it makes good news stories. The real argument is that it will make us somewhat worse off. But that's a long digression. And I should say, I don't agree with that real argument. I don't think we know whether it makes us better or worse off. I think that as far as I can tell, climate change has both positive and negative effects. Both of them are quite uncertain. We're talking about effects spread over a long period of time, and the future is very uncertain. And therefore, I don't think we know whether the negative effects are bigger than the positive ones. Although lots of people believe they do. But even if we did, my point is, if you look at the respectable sources of information, such as the IPCC or Nordhaus, the scale of the costs is much less than the rhetoric implies.
Mm-hmm. It is a sufficiently complicated issue, and one that I sufficiently know, or I know sufficiently little about, that I try not to make pronouncements about global warming. But something that does seem safe to say to me is that the risks are sufficiently non-negligible that it's something that has to be taken very seriously. I think that's a safe thing to say. And what I was going to say, the reason that I brought that up is I recently spoke with Deirdre McCloskey, that you know, and we talked about classical liberalism, and climate change came up in the context of something that the free market might not be well suited to handle. And Deirdre's response was that she thinks it is best to be left to the free market. She thinks that on the one hand, as we were talking about it, we placed classical liberalism on a spectrum, and we were talking about the market engineers maybe on the left, so socialists, something like that, and then conservatives on the right. Conservatives don't want to make any changes. The socialists want to make a lot of changes, but her thoughts were that and maybe I'm wrong, but I think this is what I'm recalling. The conservatives just are sticking their head in the sand. The liberals, not her sort of liberals, think they know much more than they do, and she doesn't trust them. But her position is that the classical liberal is optimistic about the future, and trusts that rather than let government intervene, the best bet is to believe that engineers will solve the problem in the future if it becomes
There are two
existential.
different kinds of solutions. The one for which that's right is adaptation. That is to say, changing your crop variety in order to adjust to the fact that the temperature is a degree higher than it used to be is a private good for the individual farmer. It is in the interest of people who produce seeds to try to breed varieties that will be optimized against the changed environment. So there you can expect engineering to do it. But for keeping the climate change from happening, it's not clear that it's in the private interest of anybody to do that. Now, it might turn out, if the government gives lots of money to people who do that some clever person will find out a good way of doing it, but I don't trust the government to decide who to give money to. As I say, the government currently has a massive policy that is almost certainly killing several million people a year. That's the biofuels. I don't have numbers on it, obviously. But if you've got 200 million people and you're making their chief food stuff twice as expensive as it used to be, and they're poor people, it seems to me that's got to raise mortality rates noticeably. So it's not as if, government action always does good things.
So your position, and I'm inferring here, is that because we can't trust government to do only the things that it can do well, the best bet, or what you would like to see if you were, you don't want to be king, but if you could snap your fingers and make these things happen, is that we wouldn't prevent global warming because you don't want a government to be interfering, and you would end up relying on this second situation in which adaptation, as you put it, where engineers solve the problem in the future.
That's right. Global warming might or might not happen very much, depending on sort of the accidents of technology. If it turns out that nuclear or thermonuclear or solar and wind plus battery become cheaper than fossil fuel, we will then produce much less CO2 and global warming will slow down and maybe eventually stop. CO2 doesn't have an infinite lifetime after all. It's in the atmosphere doesn't. CO2 itself does. And that is to say, it isn't radioactive. It doesn't decay. It's just that it gets taken out of the atmosphere in various ways. So I'm not necessarily predicting that it will continue, but I am saying that I do not think having the government try to make it stop is a sensible strategy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I should just say I spoke with somebody else a few days ago. His name is Tim Palmer. He's a leading physicist and meteorologist at Oxford. And he was essentially echoing what you were saying in that we really don't know if climate change is going to happen. What he narrowed it down to is that we don't have enough understanding of clouds, really, and things could go one way or the other. But his position, based on everything he knows, is that it is something that should be taken seriously.
That is, my view is not that we don't know it's going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen a century from now, but I think we can be pretty confident that the CO2 concentration of the atmosphere will be higher 5 years from now than it is now, and that probably average temperatures will be a little higher 5 years from now, although there's a lot of random noise in that signal, so they might not be. But if you go 20 or 30 years, it would be surprising if average temperature didn't go up a bit. On the other hand, you're talking about very small changes. That is, the total global warming so far since about 1913, which is roughly when it started, is somewhat over 1 degree centigrade, less than 2 degrees centigrade. So it's a matter of, you have to imagine that very small changes. The way I like to put it is that if you believe the high end of the IPCC estimates for the end of the century, by the end of the century, Minnesota will be as warm as Iowa is now. Well, Iowa manages pretty well. So anyway, but that would be a long discussion. But anyway, but I think what strikes me is really as most uncertain. I mean, there is some uncertainty about the rate of temperature increase, but I think more uncertainty about the effects on climate in other ways, about the question of whether you get more flooding and such and drought, and most uncertainty about the effect of whatever happens on people. that I don't think we know whether raising temperature by 2 degrees results in more people dying or fewer people dying, because it results in more heat waves, but also fewer cold waves, basically. And currently, many more people die of cold than of heat.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad that we've spoken about just some things that government might do better, because I think it's important to acknowledge, as it would otherwise be difficult to take the thesis seriously if, for instance, you suggested that the free market.
Air pollution is probably a better example. That is, there are lots of problems the government are dealing with climate change. Climate change, I think of as something where, under some imaginable circumstances, it would make sense for government to deal with it, just not the circumstances that exist. On the other hand, air pollution, there are certainly forms of air pollution which pretty clearly do real damage, and ways in which government can deal with them, which are not all that difficult. So I would not be surprised if you could somehow make a government if you could somehow make a very short list of things the government was allowed to do, that it would have good results. It's just I don't know any way of making and enforcing such a list.